I don't think that they necessarily believe it, but they're going to say anything that helps them cling to power. And right now, their position in power is falling apart. I think that's the real issue. The globalists that are ruling Europe want desperately to justify their existence and to perpetuate their power. If you admit that the war in Ukraine is lost, that you have no means of changing that outcome, and that ultimately you should focus on the restoration of your own economic productivity and prosperity, you're not going to retain power. You're going to be removed because the populations in these countries are already concluding they don't want to fight a war with Russia. I mean, this is why when I listen to these ridiculous remarks, I always say, well, what about all of the recruiting stations that are being set up in Oslo, Stockholm, Amsterdam, Berlin, and the tens of thousands of volunteers rushing to join the military for the Great Crusade against Russia? Well, I don't see it. Do you? I don't see any evidence for that showing up. I don't see any appetite for it at all. I think it's all nonsense. When this sinks in, people like Callas, who is running all over the place talking about the war in Ukraine will end when all the Russians leave Ukraine, she's a fool and she's a laughingstock. It's going to take time for it to sink in, but it's beginning. We're at the beginning of this process, and the Russians don't need to lift a finger. All these governments will be removed. They will go out of business because they cannot sustain themselves on the basis of these lies. Again, it's the empire of lies is crumbling. That's the real success story for the Russians in eastern Ukraine, because the Russians have no interest in marching any further west. Who in their right mind wants to take over anything today in Europe, let alone Western Ukraine? It's an enormous burden. There's no advantage to it. There are no great resources to be acquired, and the populations there are troublesome. So why would anybody want to do it? I just don't think that is sunk in completely, but I think it's beginning.
Well, across Europe, we don't have any big recruitment stations getting, sending our youth into this war. But in Germany, you have Chancellor Merz asking Zelensky not to allow young Ukrainian men to escape the country. That is, they belong there either for, to help the economy or to, of course, send them down into the trenches to kill Russians. But also in other places across the West, you have politicians arguing for lower pressuring Zelensky to lower the conscription age or even deporting Ukrainians so they can again refill the trenches. How do you see after this war is over? To what extent do you think the Ukrainians will, I guess, turn on the Europeans? Because I already saw a recent press release. Oh no, sorry, there was a tweet from the former press secretary of Zelensky, and she was arguing that we shouldn't listen to the Europeans. They have no strategy, they don't have no weapons, they have no money, they have no influence. Why are we, continuing to let them, why are we listening to them? And the only thing that comes from Europe now is, continue to fight, to die a little bit more. At best, we can, make Ukraine lose. Make Ukraine lose a little bit slower. But this is not strategy, and also it's starting to seem cruel now that we're reaching the very brutal end of this war.
I think there's a much higher probability in the near future of seeing Polish and German soldiers and police rounding up and forcibly deporting Ukrainians than there is of any war fighting against Russia. I think the Poles and the Germans are both fed up with all these young Ukrainian men that are sustaining themselves at the expense of the Polish and German governments, and they'd like them to go away. They'd like them to go home. So I think that's much more likely in the short term than anything else. Now, there is a concern that certain elements of Ukraine, and I'm talking about small numbers, could launch terrorist attacks in Germany and Poland and France and Great Britain and other countries in retribution for what they feel is their betrayal. I mean, that's not impossible. But that just reinforces the need to deport the Ukrainians. And frankly, if you don't deport these Ukrainians and send them back home when this terrible war finally comes to a conclusion, I don't think Ukraine will survive. It needs manpower. It needs Ukrainians to come back and repopulate that which turns out to be Ukraine. And I don't know what that looks like. But with each passing day, it looks to me as though the map that was devised by Medvedev looks more and more appealing because it means a large chunk of this thing called Western Ukraine is somehow or another annexed by or confederated with Poland. If that's necessary for the Poles to push the Ukrainians back into Ukraine, I think the Poles would probably agree to that. Because again, all the future events now have to be viewed against the backdrop of two other very important events: the disintegration of the European Union and the disintegration of NATO. Those things are on the table. It was interesting. Earlier today, I was listening to Rubio, the so-called Secretary of State, who doesn't seem to spend much time being Secretary of State, and is also the National Security Advisor and running the National Security Council staff in the White House. And he was insisting that the Europeans were ungrateful and unworthy of our support because they were complaining about the potential use of American military power against Venezuela, but they were happy to see us use Tomahawk missiles and other weapons against the Russians in Ukraine. It's a rather strange juxtaposition because you're talking about two parts of the empire of lies. The notion that Venezuela in any way threatens us, no. Venezuela is a big drug hub, no. Ukraine is not a vital strategic interest for the United States, never was, never will be. The best that we could hope for in Ukraine was an early end of the conflict and the restoration of some measure of political, economic, and social stability in that country. That was always the interest that we had. The Europeans, and unfortunately people in Washington who were also part of the globalist camp, saw the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to destroy Russia, to harm Putin, just as foolish people in Washington are looking at the opportunity to remove Maduro, as though removing him will solve a problem for us anywhere in Venezuela. It won't. You know, when you begin trying to remove governments, you begin trying to destroy stability and order in any nation, regardless of whether you like it or not, you take enormous risks. And that's what we did in Ukraine, and now we're about to pay the price. And I don't think there's going to be much money left over for anyone. I don't think the Europeans are going to get the hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars from the Russians that they want. They want to steal from the central bank in Brussels. I don't think that's going to work. And I think the sooner Ukraine falls apart, the sooner this war comes to an obvious conclusion, the less likely the Europeans are to take the risks associated with taking the money that belongs to Russia and redistributing it to organized crime in Western Ukraine, which is effectively what you've got right now. Ukraine is an organized crime state. It's not a viable nation state any longer. So I wish people would stop talking about the stupid things and begin asking the question, how do we bring this to a rapid close so that we can begin the process of restoring some measure of order and stability to this place we called Ukraine? Nobody seems to want to go there. And if that's true, then Medvedev's map is the most likely outcome, because the Russians aren't going to wait around for the rest of us to make decisions about what we will or won't support in Ukraine, because they too have an interest in stability in Ukraine. They want an end to this thing. They'd like to get back to some reasonable commercial relationship, not just with Ukraine, but also with Poland, Germany, and the rest of Europe. So they'll move on their own. That's why I think all this discussion right now in the Trump administration is all irrelevant. Because from the beginning, Donald Trump, regardless of what he says, he wants something to happen because he wants to be at the center of it. He's very big into what we refer to loosely as optics. He wants to be the center. He wants to be worshipped. He wants to be glorified as the great man who brought peace. The problem is he's done the opposite. He joined the very people that he condemned and criticized while he was running for president. There's no difference between his administration and Blinken and the rest of these people and what they did under Biden. So right now, what does it all mean? I think, again, with each passing day, the empire of lies crumbles. Eventually, it's all going to come out. It's all going to look bad. And it's going to have an impact at the voting booth, at the ballot box, if not earlier than that in the streets.